Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about apartheid, where we will learn all about the history of racial discrimination in South Africa. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to explain the creation and end of apartheid in South Africa, and the roles of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. Apartheid was the legal segregation and discrimination of races in South Africa. Civil disobedience means refusing to comply with certain unjust laws as a peaceful form of political protest. F.W. de Klerk was the president of South Africa who negotiated the end of apartheid laws. Nelson Mandela was the leader of the anti-apartheid movement and the first democratically elected black president of South Africa. South Africa was one of the earliest colonies set up in Africa due to its vast and rich resources. The major natural resources of the territory are diamonds and gold, so you will understand why the land was in high demand. First, the Dutch colonized the land, then the British took over in the early 1900s. South Africa was granted its independence in 1910, but Britain's last action before leaving was to hand the government over to the former Dutch and British settlers remaining in the country, an all-white government in a mostly black country. You may recognize some similarities between apartheid in South Africa and the Jim Crow era in the United States, but the one major difference is population. In apartheid-era South Africa, almost 90% of the population was oppressed African Bantu ethnic groups, and only about 10% were the former European colonists. The reverse was true in the United States, where a huge majority oppressed a small minority. After a few decades of white control, a rough economy resulted in voters electing leaders that promised to implement the apartheid laws. Apartheid translates to separateness. A major purpose of these laws was to control the job market in favor of whites by limiting the possibilities of black citizens' chances getting work. The Population Registration Act had far-reaching effects for people of non-white backgrounds. This gave every citizen a single racial identity, and, based on the race, people were forced to follow different laws. Only white citizens were given the freedom to travel anywhere they wanted, whenever they wanted. Other groups had to receive permission notes from whites to enter the cities daily just to attend their jobs. Separate public transportation, facilities, beaches, and dining areas and restaurants were set up to keep the races separate. Couples of mixed races were illegal, and existing mixed-race families were forced to split up and live in different areas. Non-white citizens were not wanted in the cities, so ramshackle housing was hastily thrown up just outside cities, where over 3.5 million people were forced to resettle in these homelands. Protesting against apartheid laws was an imprisonable offense, and only whites were allowed to vote, which kept this system going strong for decades. So what? Why did those in power in South Africa pass and enforce apartheid laws? In the United States in 1900, about 11% of citizens were the oppressed African American minority group. Even if voting rights weren't hindered by Jim Crow laws, it was highly unlikely back then that enough African American politicians would get elected to result in a major change in U.S. politics. In South Africa, about 90% of the country were discriminated racial groups, while about 10% controlled all the power, positions of leadership, and economic wealth. The most significant law passed in apartheid South Africa was eliminating the right to vote for non-white citizens. If those 90% had the right to vote, massive changes would occur, which would have erased the benefits of power for the former Dutch and British colonists. Even though protesting apartheid laws was illegal, many leaders in the South African community emerged to fight against these laws. The African National Congress, or ANC, and other anti-apartheid groups led protests, some of which turned violent and resulted in loss of life. Nelson Mandela, a lawyer who had learned a thing or two from Gandhi's revolution in India, promoted a non-violent protest in South Africa. Mandela encouraged civil disobedience, or refusing to follow laws that are unfair and unjust. His followers were arrested in the hundreds and thousands, overcrowding the prisons only to be released hours or days later to immediately begin protesting unfair laws once again. Mandela himself was called a communist terrorist by his opponents, and was sentenced to life in prison for leading the movement. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in a prison cell, waiting for the day when his supporters on the outside would turn the tide. After decades of protest fighting and economic pressure from other countries, even white South Africa began to recognize that the apartheid laws were backwards. In 1990, new South African President F.W. de Klerk set Mandela free, shook the man's hand, and promised to begin to overturn the racist apartheid laws. The most significant step de Klerk made was to open up South Africa to truly democratic elections. All citizens, regardless of race, would have the right to vote. The following election, with millions and millions more citizens able to vote in South Africa, Nelson Mandela became the country's first black president elected in a democratic election. He and his government worked for years to eliminate the remaining apartheid-era laws and to reverse the racism that had become so deeply ingrained in the country's identity. Mandela had the opportunity to seek revenge against the opponents who imprisoned him for 27 years. However, he recognized the need for the country to heal, and for white and black South Africans to no longer view each other as the enemy within their own country. In the years since, the country has not completely healed from the strife of apartheid, but it is progressing forward. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? When someone else does something wrong to us, it is natural to want something bad to happen back to them. If a classmate knocks you over, you want to push them right back. Back in the ancient days, revenge was literally the law. An eye for an eye meant that if my actions, say, shooting a rubber band across the classroom, resulted in someone else's eyes being put out, then the judges would get back at me by putting my eye out as well. These days, a lot of people like to use lawsuits to get their revenge by emptying someone else's wallet. But that hasn't stopped some impulsive young people from thinking the best answer to any offense is to come up punching. I've even heard some young people say that not getting revenge shows weakness. But how can the easy, natural response be a show of strength? Anyone can get revenge easily, so why should you be impressed by it? What would our society, our country, our world be like if punishments for crimes could be handed out revenge style? Well, there's a very simple answer to that question, which comes, maybe, from Gandhi. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Nelson Mandela, when he became president, had about 27 years' worth of reasons to seek out revenge against the governments that took away his life. But he recognized that making himself feel a little better wouldn't solve any problems. Revenge isn't an end to a problem. If you get your revenge against someone who insulted you, that person will only want to get revenge back for the revenging. This continues a cycle that results in more anger, more hate, and more violence. So, you want to prove your strength, prove you're not weak, resist the impulse to seek out revenge when you're wronged. That is much more impressive. Wow, so learning about apartheid South Africa is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? The word apartheid means... How did apartheid affect blacks in South Africa? He was the voice of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He was jailed by the government for 27 years on charges of sabotage and other crimes committed while he led the movement against apartheid. Upon his release from prison, he helped lead the transition toward multiracial democracy in South Africa. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 and served as the President of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. Which world leader is being described by these statements? What role did Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk play in the evolution of apartheid in South Africa? We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall, without fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable rights to human dignity, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. Why was Nelson Mandela's inaugural address so focused on racial issues? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the apartheid era of South Africa. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.